Okay, so then we'll start and we'll see you, Lursa, on the flip side. All right, take care. Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar on the life of Jeannette Rankin. I'm Donna Ward, the president of the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area. Our league is happy to sponsor this event for Women's History Month, since Jeannette Rankin's life is an inspiring reminder of how individual Americans of courage and conviction have helped shape our democracy. While many of us may be familiar with her quote, I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last. There's much more to Jeannette's story than introducing the debate in Congress of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. Our guest speaker tonight will help us learn more about her story and how her example may make us demand more of our politicians and public servants today. Lorissa Rinehart is a celebrated women's historian, author, and public speaker. Her writing explores the powerful intersections of women's history, politics, war, and peace. Her latest book, Winning the Earthquake, How Jeannette Rankin Defied All Odds to Become America's First Congresswoman, was called an illuminating biography by Publishers Weekly and gripping from start to finish by acclaimed historian Clara Bingham. Winning the Earthquake is the first authoritative biography of this pioneering female American politician. Lorissa has also written a biography of the trailblazing female war correspondent Dickie Chappelle and offers a weekly podcast and newsletter called The Female Body Politic. After Larissa's presentation, we'll have time for questions, but please feel free to put questions in the Q&A as we go along. Larissa, I'll turn it over to you. And I should also introduce my colleague Ann Moore, who's also from the League of Women Voters, and she'll be helping us ask questions at the end from the Q&A. Larissa, it's on to you.
Well, thank you so much, Donna and Anne, for having me and for the League of Women Voters Montclair. I am so honored to be here. I've been really lucky in that I've been able to talk to a lot of League of Women Voters around the country. And I have to say, it's really the League of Women Voters who is holding this country together to a large degree. From a mile high view, you all are doing the work that is necessary to preserve our democracy and to move us forward. And so I'm always so appreciative of the opportunity to speak with all of you. As Donna mentioned, I'm the author of Winning the Earthquake, which is my new biography of Jeannette Rankin. And, even some of the most politically educated people that I know when I ask them, do you know who Jeannette Rankin is? They often say no. Her story has really been largely omitted by history for a number of different reasons that we can get into. But when I was researching this book, I was just really surprised at every turn at how relevant and prescient her story is. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with you this evening. And I do have a slide presentation that I would like to share. I will do my best to forward the slides. I often forget. So if Donna, you could just raise your hand if I forget to do the slides, that would be great. But this is Jeannette Rankin, and this is her addressing the crowd at the NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. on the day that she was sworn in on April 2nd, 1917, as the first woman in Congress. But she certainly started her life a long, long way from Washington, D.C. She was born on a ranch outside of Missoula in 1880, 9 years before Montana was even a state. And these are her father and her mother and her she's the eldest there next to her mother, and they're her two younger sisters. And then her father was actually an immigrant from Canada who was a failed miner turned engineer turned sort of successful small businessman. But Jeannette grew up at a unique time and place in American history, in Montana. That was of course, quite rural at the time. This picture there is her house in town, but she started her life on a ranch outside of Missoula. It wasn't that far from Missoula, 3 miles really. But as they say in Montana, there's only two seasons, winter and August. And so in the wintertime, it was almost impossible to get into town from their ranch, even though it was relatively close. It was up a rather steep mountain pass. And so right at that time in that place, everyone had to do the work to survive, let alone thrive. And that led to a lot more gender equality than we often think of when we're imagining, right, the 1880s, the Gilded Age, it's the bustles and the corsets. But in Montana, in rural Montana, if you're a homesteader and your wife gives birth, you have to help deliver that baby and take care of that infant and your wife while she recovers. Other side of the same coin, at harvest time, women had to help bring in the harvest, right? It was all hands on deck all the time. And Jeanette's upbringing was really no different, especially because she was the eldest of six in her family, and a boy didn't come along until she was much older, about six, I think. And so her father really took her under as his wing as his protege. And she was also just sort of a natural born leader. There was this instance that I write about in my book where she sees this horse, this yearling, coming in from the fields to the paddock, but she sees that it's, been injured. And she crawls into the paddock and she sees that it actually has this huge gash. And so she convinces the ranch hands to help her get the horse to the ground while she runs inside for a kettle of boiling water and a needle and thread, and actually stitches the horse's gash closed, right? And she was all of 12 at the time. So she really grows up with this sense that she is equal to anyone and any man. And then at the same time, there's another unique thing about Montana, which is there's pretty big culture of grassroots democracy, especially in the country, right? Like we can all imagine the barn raising where everyone gets together and works together to raise their neighbor's barn because they know that if their neighbor has a barn and that they need something, they're more likely they can have a stronger community, right? And they survive as a community. If it's a long winter and I have more pork and you have more beans, we can get together to have a complete meal, right? Grassroots democracy for them was a matter of survival. Um, uh-oh. Now my slides aren't where, oh, there we go. Sorry. Um, so she really grows up at this unique intersection of a greater degree of gender equality and uh and grassroots democracy. Now, another thing occurred when she was a child that really continued to influence her throughout her political career and throughout her life, which was she witnessed the genocide of Native and Indigenous peoples. Right, it was the Salish and Nez Perce peoples generally, and she really saw the violence that was brought to bear on them, and it was impressed upon her from a young age that there was no place for violence in a democracy, and that in fact, violence and democracy were antithetical to one another. And she also had this incredible inborn sense of justice. There's this famous story of her arguing with her father because she felt the ranch hands weren't being paid a fair wage, and she was successful in getting them a raise. And then finally, I mean, it's almost mythological, but she really did read the United States Constitution by candlelight as a child on her Montana ranch. I mean, this is the stuff of, founding mythology in Jeanette's childhood. But even despite all these sort of factors that were swirling around her as a child, she really didn't get introduced to social justice work until she visited her brother in Boston. Now, her brother, Wellington Rankin, was at Harvard Law School. He already had a degree from Harvard and then a master's degree from Oxford. Interestingly, her entire family was incredibly educated. All of her siblings, four of whom were girls, including her, who survived to adulthood, got at least a master's degree, and her brother got a master's degree and a law degree. So they're an incredibly educated family. But Wellington was at Harvard getting his law degree, and he had a mental breakdown. And at the time, right, psychology wasn't really a field. Mental health wasn't discussed, particularly when in the case of men, you are sort of meant to, grin and bear it. But the Rankins were a rather enlightened family, and they sent Jeannette out to Boston to try and help him recover. Well, while she was there, she, loved to take long walks. And she went for a long walk. She went through long walks, for long walks through Boston. And she ended up walking through the tenements and the slums and was introduced for the first time to really industrialized poverty. She had seen poverty before at home, right? Miners in her home state, particularly, were oppressed. Homesteaders lived a hardscrabble life. But this was an entirely different degree of poverty. And it was also contrasted with a huge degree of wealth. There was this incredible wealth disparity between the urban poor and the urban rich. And it was the first time that Jeannette really encountered a problem that she didn't know how to solve. I often talk about that she had the mind of an engineer as a child. She figured out like her father had a hay lift and it was broken. And I think she was like 10, and she figured out how it was broken and how to fix it and was able to explain how to fix it, right? So she just really has this mind that understands how things work and how to fix them. But with industrialized poverty, she didn't know what to do. And so she goes to San Francisco, travels a lot. She goes to San Francisco and she ends up volunteering in the Telegraph Hill Settlement House. You might all be familiar with Jane Addams' famous Hull House, which was really an experiment in social work. It was a place for the urban poor to receive medical care, education, and just a general respite from the difficulty of poverty in an urban setting. And a number of different women started similar organizations across the country, including at Telegraph Hill. And so Jeannette spent a lot of time there, volunteering for free. She was at this point in her late 20s, and we can talk about why she started her career later on if anyone's interested. But while she was there, the two founders encouraged her to apply to the uh, New York School of Philanthropy, which is now the Columbia School of Social Work. And so she did, and she got in. And she ended up going to New York and for her master's degree. She had her undergraduate from the University of Montana, which was at the time in Missoula. But even so, right, she was a highly educated person. She was well read. She had a, college degree. She was from an extremely educated family, but she still wasn't really familiar with the I, I want to say like the sum total of the suffrage movement, right? Like she had heard it, but she didn't really know how extensive that history of the suffrage was movement was already in the United States and what it was that they were fighting for. And it wasn't even in school that she really got introduced to the suffrage movement. Well, it was in school, but it was through her field work. And so, in addition to doing coursework, students at the New York School of Philanthropy were required to do field work. And part of Jeanette's field work was going to the city court. If anyone's familiar with Lower Manhattan, she was at the Tombs, which is still there on sort of the border of Tribeca and Chinatown. And her job was to help women who had been convicted of uh, sex work for the first time to find alternative employment. And if they could find alternative employment, then their sentences would basically be commuted. And it was her supervisor at that and a clerk at that night court who asked her to help her write a speech on women's suffrage. She was a suffragist, and sadly, her name has been lost to history, but I always love to credit her because so many small actions by women lead to the changing of history, and our names are not remembered, but we are nevertheless important. So I always try to highlight this night clerk who introduced Jeannette Rankin to suffrage by asking her to write a speech. And so Jeannette goes to the New York Public Library and she is both incensed and inspired. She's incensed that women did not already have the vote. After having simply asked for it, she felt that they should have the vote. Reading just a small amount, she understood why women's political power was important and was just absolutely angry that that women did not already have the vote in the United States of America. But then she was also incredibly inspired because she saw in women's suffrage and women in the women's vote the capacity to right so many wrongs in society. Because as she would often say, the men and women are like two hands. It doesn't make any sense to use the left hand without using the right. And without enfranchising women, right, democracy in America wasn't able to reach its full potential. And so she really jumpstarts her career in suffrage, pardon me. Soon thereafter, she goes to Seattle. She really bounces around America. She's incredibly well traveled, but she goes to Seattle and starts volunteering at the NASA office there. And, she just shows up one day as a volunteer. She was actually taking more courses at the University of Washington at the time. But so she shows up, and I think in trying to like haze the newbie, they hand Jeannette this huge pile of posters and tells her to go and wheat paste them up around the city, thinking that she'll never be able to handle this amount of work. But Jeannette, having grown up in rural Montana, was like, this is so much lighter than the stacks of wood that I've, been piling up for my entire life. And so she really just like goes out throughout Seattle and has no problem putting these posters up. And most notably, she hangs one up in a barber shop. Now, but really then especially, right? The barber shop is like the sanctuary of men. Women do not go in the barber shop, and certainly suffragists do not go in the barber shop. But Jeannette goes into this barber shop and she convinces them to hang one of her suffrage posters. And they laugh at her, but she says, to the leaders at the NASA office, she says it doesn't matter that they're laughing at me. It only matters that they're talking about it. And so they're so impressed by sort of Jeanette's grit and capacity that she gets noticed very quickly. And they start sending her to these very difficult places to talk to men, to like squeeze every vote that they can out, right? Because it's like all these campaigns to get suffrage enshrined in state constitutions came down to just a few votes very often. But Jeannette excels at this. And the national office starts to notice her as well. And she ends up getting hired as the field organizer, which oh, it's not, that's not the exact title. I can't recall the exact title right now, but it's basically like the general field organizer. And the next campaign that she starts working on is in California. So Washington passes in 1910, I want to say, and then she's in California in 1911. And because she grew up right around these like ranchers and loggers and miners, she's really talented at talking to men of that kind and relating to those kinds of men. And so the Nassau sends her to mostly rural counties in California. And there's this one story that I always love to tell of this little town called French Gulch. Now, it's 1911. And the only way to get to French Gulch, which is in like the Shasta Mountains of Northern California, is by stagecoach. Even at that time, right, there's cars, there's trains. If you have to get someplace by stagecoach, that's a really remote place. And it's a small little mining town, and it consists of 6 bars and a brothel. And so Jeanette gets there, it's summertime, it's quitting time, and all the men are, drinking their beers outside. And Jeanette literally gets, a fruit box, puts it in the middle of the street, and starts talking about why these men should enfranchise women. And she says that if you enfranchise us, we're really actually going to vote for you. We want corporate oversight of, or government oversight of corporations. We want worker safety. We want higher wages. We want you to be able to organize. So enfranchising us empowers you. And when the returns from French Gulch came in, it was 93% for women's suffrage. And it just goes to show the power of coalition building when we can cut through the noise and talk about why sharing power benefits us all. And that's always an inspiring story for me, especially right now. But after a few years of organizing with Nassau, Jeanette is home for Christmas, and she reads in the paper that an assemblyman, DJ Donahue on Montana, is going to introduce a bill to put women's suffrage on the ballot. And so Jeanette is very inspired by this and says, I want to come home and work on women's suffrage in Montana full time. So she, relinquishes her post as field secretary and moves back to Montana and goes to Assemblyman Donahue's office to talk to him about introducing this bill. Well, in talking to him, she discovers that he actually was introducing this bill as a joke. Now, I'll try to get through this very quickly, but it speaks to the political landscape at the time. So, but at this time, the 17th Amendment hadn't been passed yet, right? Which was for the direct election of senators. And state assemblies would elect senators, not the populace. And at the time, Montana was known as a one company state because Anaconda Copper, which controlled all of Montana's mining interests and also bribed the Montana state legislature and owned all but one of Montana's newspapers. I told you her story was prescient. Had basically told this Montana state legislature that it wanted, its man elected to the Senate. But the people of Montana that year had actually gotten to vote. It was a straw vote, and it didn't count, but they voted for a progressive candidate. And it was very clearly the result of corruption that the preferred candidate wasn't being elected. And there was this really nasty knockdown, drag out fight in the state legislature trying to come to a consensus on who they should elect. And DJ Donahue, Assemblyman Donahue, decided that it would be really a great way to break the tension for everyone to have a good laugh over, the women's vote, because who thinks women should be able to vote? Not them. I did say there was more gender parity. I didn't say it was a gender equality utopia. Anyway, Jeanette goes to his office and she says, look, DJ, she again like appeals to his sense of reason. She says, women want the direct election of senators, so do you. We want corporate money out of politics, so do you. And we want higher corporate taxes, and so do you. And again, she says, if you give us the vote, we will actually help you forward your agenda more quickly. And so he ends up introducing the bill in earnest. But that's not enough. So she makes her speech on the floor of the legislature, and she is accorded with some respect while she is speaking. But after her speech, women and the other suffragists who are there, are really lampooned and derided to the point where Jeanette said that they wished that they could just melt into the floor. Nevertheless, she persists, and in the next 2 years, from 1911 to 1913, I say that Jeannette built what I call a constellation of power. So basically, she identified representatives in every precinct in Montana, and she would say to them, "Look, you know how to speak to your communities. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You know how to organize. If you have questions, ask me, but I'm not here to give you orders." And so very quickly, right, she creates this grassroots movement that is autonomous and that is able to flip both houses of the state legislature from adamantly against to almost unanimously for women's suffrage. And in 1913, they pass a bill that puts women's suffrage on the ballot. So now it goes to the vote, right? Now it goes to voters and all male voters on whether or not to enfranchise women. And again, this constellation of power comes out, activates very quickly, and it really looks like women's suffrage is going to get passed. But enter Anaconda Copper, who does not want a progressive movement to double the number of its voters. And they literally attempt to try and stuff the ballot boxes with anti-votes in order to uh, scuttle the chances of women's suffrage. Now, Jeannette and her, fellow suffragists get wise to this. They call the AP in New York. And they say what's going on. The AP, releases it, and by morning, Anaconda's plan has been foiled, and the women of Montana get suffrage, but not without, right, corporate attempts to interfere with the will of the people. But this, of course, is not enough for Jeannette. She has so much more ambition, and she takes a little time off. She goes to New Zealand, where women have the right to vote and have since I believe 1899 or 1890. I can't remember, but for a while now. So she goes to New Zealand, and rather than like take a break, she rents herself out as a seamstress and says she's an American seamstress to try and raise her rates, and encourages all the women around her to raise their rates as well. But she basically, this is a way for her to be able to talk to the women of New Zealand, women voters of New Zealand, about how they use their vote and why it's important to them and how it feels to be an enfranchised woman in this country, right? And what they've gotten done with their vote. And she uses this as sort of research of why it's important to enfranchise an entire population of women in a nation. And she comes back and she decides that the fastest way to move the ball forward in the goal of women's suffrage is for a woman to be elected to the House of the People, to Congress. And she sees that she really has the unique opportunity and capacity to be that woman because she has this, grassroots network that she's built. She's very recognized and respected in Montana. She also has the backing of her family. This is her brother Wellington there, who was a great political ally of hers. But then Montana has one more very important piece of the puzzle that's required for a woman to get elected, particularly at that time. And it was what's called an open state. And so we would call it today a multiple member congressional district. Montana had two congressional seats, and everyone in Montana got to vote on both of those seats and would rank their choices. So everywhere Jeannette would go in her campaign, she would say, vote for your local man, because there's a crowded field, right? She would say, vote for your local man and vote for Jeannette Rankin. So her campaign was additive rather than subtractive. And no one had to choose. It wasn't a zero-sum game. No one had to choose between her and a man, right? They could vote for their friend or this guy who helped with their farm or their business and Jeannette Rankin. So she paired that with an incredible campaign, and she was hyper specific about speaking to local issues. I always tell the story where she goes to Baker, which is in way, 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 way east Montana. It's this little tiny dryland farming town. And she talks there specifically about securing low interest farming loans and regulating interstate transportation so that their goods wouldn't be overcharged to be transported. And she talks about appointing federal agricultural inspectors because at the time, right, most of the agricultural products were shipped to the South where they were priced by a local agricultural inspector who, of course, favored right, the agricultural products from his state. And she said, if you elect me, I will be sure that we have federal inspectors. And this was a big deal to these people, right? This was their livelihood. And she did this across Montana with ranchers and farmers and businessmen and miners and loggers and just everybody. She really spoke to their issues. And when the votes came back, uh, well, let me say this. On election day, all of Anaconda Copper's newspapers, collectively known as the Copper Press, announced that Jeannette had lost her race. But her brother Wellington was really a student of right voting trends. And then again, as now, not all the votes are counted all at once, right? And you can especially imagine in Montana in November that it took a long time to get all the votes from these small towns, right? That you can only get to by ox cart or horse. And he noticed that the trend lines coming in, these trickles of votes from these little towns were really skewing Jeannette's way. And so he called her and he said, do not, under any circumstances, concede this race because you have won. And for I think the next 3 days, the papers continued to print that she had lost, she had lost, she had lost. But Jeannette refused to concede. And by the time all the votes were counted, Jeannette was elected. She came in second place by 5,000 votes, which is a huge, it was really a landslide in Montana in 1916. And she was elected as the first woman in Congress, which was an extraordinary accomplishment. But her first day in Congress was really fraught for a number of reasons. As Donna mentioned, did introduce the bill that would become the 19th Amendment on that first day. But the other thing that happened on her first day of Congress, which was April 2nd, 1917, was that Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, right? The Great War, World War One. Now, at the time, right, the sort of war fervor had been building. And Carrie Chapman Catt, president of Nassau, here beside Jeannette, had really tacked the sails of women's suffrage to their support of the war. Because she believed that if women could demonstrate their patriotism through, right, the support of the war, then men would, finally be convinced that women deserved the vote. Now, Jeannette didn't necessarily disagree with Carrie's political calculus, but she also knew that, right, it was a short term thinking. And she knew that even if women got the right to vote, even if women got the access to the ballot, all of the other things that the suffragist movement had been fighting for would absolutely disappear in the firestorm of war. I mean, it wasn't just the vote that women were advocating for. They were advocating for democratic reforms. Jeannette was a proponent of ranked choice voting, multiple member congressional districts, universal absentee voting, and abolishing the Electoral College, among many other things. Reforms that we continue to debate and discuss, and many of which are decidedly good for our democracy. These are things that were within, right, the suffragist discourse at the time. They were getting ready to fight for reproductive care, reproductive access, and federal funding for women's healthcare and the federal funding for women's healthcare, right? Like which didn't exist in the federal budget at the time. And Jeannette knew that if war was declared, all of these things would disappear. And history really shows that she was right. Now, added to this was Jeannette's deeply held sense of pacifism. And so when her name was called in Congress, um, Jeannette voted unequivocally no for the war, along with 50 other members of Congress and I believe six members of the Senate. But this really incensed Carrie Chapman Catt, and Jeannette was very much ostracized from the suffrage movement moving forward. And in a similar way to Alice Paul, right, who wasn't invited to the bill signing of the 19th Amendment, Jeannette was like cast out into the wild, which I personally feel was a great loss to the suffrage movement and to American history. Um, but a lot of historians point to her no vote as the reason why she wasn't able to run for a second term, um, a contiguous second term. But in my research, I discovered that it wasn't the war vote that prevented her from doing this. It was that right after the election, Anaconda Copper went to its bought and paid for state legislature and said, gerrymander her out of her district. And their unofficial slogan for this shadow campaign was, you don't want to keep a woman in power, do you? And so she was gerrymandered her out of her district, and she knew she was, and she knew that she would not be able to run again, win again. And so she really put it all out in the field in her first term. And she no holds bar in fighting for the reforms that she wanted to see enacted. Um, Now, this is Jeannette planting a tree on Arbor Day in front of the Capitol there. And this picture on the other side was her with Woodrow Wilson. And then that's just another lovely portrait um, of her. Um, and I'm kind of running short on time, so I will just move on to the remainder of her life, which is as prescient as her suffrage years. And I was really grateful to be able to talk about that in my book for, I believe, the first time. And so basically, after the war, she moved to Bogart, which is a small town outside of Athens, Georgia, because she saw in the aftermath and really even before the end of the war, the birth of the military industrial complex. And she knew intrinsically that war and democracy are antithetical to one another. And she saw that, right, these corporations who profited from war were building up the machinery of war really right after armistice had been declared, before the Treaty of Versailles, right after armistice. And she wanted to try and put the world on a different path. She would often say, if you prepare for war, you get war. If you prepare for peace, you get peace. And so for the next 20 years, she worked to limit the degree to which the world could arm itself to the point of her own impoverishment. She lobbied for the Ludlow Amendment, which would have required a popular vote for the United States to declare war, unless in case of direct attack on our shores, such as Pearl Harbor. Uh, One can see how that's relevant today. She lobbied for the United States to adhere to the letter and the law of the London Naval Treaty, which limited the number of battleships that the world powers could build. In the same way that nuclear bombs have changed face of warfare, Jeanette understood that, right, when you can transport entire armies across the ocean with a relative degree of ease, that really changes the nature of war. And she knew that if we continued down this path, that world war was inevitable. Now, the other thing she recognized was this a new investment of public funds, of government funds in private corporations building the machinery of war. And so, what that meant was really at the time the expansion of corporate shipyards, building aircraft carriers and battleships and submarines. And she knew, right, that if a corporation makes an investment, they're going to want a return on that investment. If that investment is the machinery of war, the return on that investment is war, so they can build more. And this is where the title of my book comes from. She said, you can no more win a war than you can win an earthquake. And when she was reelected to Congress in 1940, and then Pearl Harbor happened, of course, in 1941, she was the lone dissenting vote in the declaration of war against Japan. Not because she thought it would change history or change minds, but because she wanted to hang a light on the path that we could have taken in 1919 or 1923 or 1929 had we chosen to. And I look at the massive investment in the defense industry in this new technology of war, which is artificial intelligence. And we find ourselves exactly at those crossroads that Jeannette kept lit for us and the opportunity to take a different path. So, but after her vote against World War II, right, Jeannette knew this was happening, but she was absolutely ostracized from, not only politics, but American public life. She served the rest of her term. She voted present for the declaration of war with Germany. She understood that war was happening and she knew that the only thing to do was to bring the men and women in harm's way home as soon as possible. She was adamant about voting yes for every single appropriations bill. She would rush back, to Washington if she was away to vote yes, to have her vote recorded in favor of it. But after the war, she really disappeared from public life. But she began to travel because she understood in a very real way we lived in a different world, in a world that was much more interconnected. And that if we were to have international peace, it required a nuanced understanding of the cultures that we shared our world with. And she wanted to understand that. So she traveled to Japan and Russia and the Middle East, and most especially India, because she was a real student of Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence movement. And she wanted to know how to bring about a nonviolent democratic revolution in America. She wanted to understand how we could achieve that. But after many, many years of silence in public life, she finally had to speak again with the first combat troops being deployed to Vietnam. And it was a very small gesture. She placed 4 ads in Montana newspapers telling women to call their congressmen and tell them to vote no for the Vietnam War. Now, this got picked up by the national press, and the burgeoning anti-war movement began to look at her as this sort of torch-bearing pacifist and feminist of America's history. And so in 1968, she, along with many others, began to organize and eventually created the Jeannette Rankin Brigade, which was a march of 5,000 women on the Capitol, protesting both the Vietnam War and the societal conditions that allowed the war to happen in the first place: racism, poverty, misogyny, lack of education, and so on and so forth. And it was the largest all-female anti-war protest at that point in history. Now, one last fact about this march was that while Jeannette was a alum of Congress and she was able to go and meet with the Speaker of the House at the time about their demands, the rest of the protest couldn't go into Congress and they assembled on the steps of the Capitol. Now, the Capitol Police forced them to disperse using an archaic law, which the Jeannette Rankin Brigade then challenged. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court and won. And that's why we are able to peaceably protest on the steps of the Capitol today because of the Rankin Brigade. Um, Jeannette really lived a life of peace and democracy and just a love for the American Constitution, which never ceases to inspire me. And I just want to close my talk with one of my favorite quotes, which I always go back to whenever I am feeling in need of a jolt of grit. And she said, "Deep down in the hearts of the American people is the living faith in democracy. It is our national religion, and it prompts in us the desire for that measure of justice which is based on equal opportunity, equal protection, equal freedom for all. In our hearts, we know that this desire can be realized only when those who submit to authority have a voice in their own government, whether that government be political, industrial, or social." So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Larissa. That was great.
Thank you.
Um, I think what we can do now is we can look, if people want to ask any questions, just put them in the Q&A or the chat, and Anne can monitor that. I mean, I there's so much to take away, from Jeanette's life, and Larissa, and one of the things when I read, Winning the Earthquake, I was astounded that, 100 years later, electoral college reform, ranked choice voting, fair redistricting, corporate money in politics. I mean, these are all the things that the League of Women Voters is still, and it's 100 years later, we're still slogging away at that. And I wonder, how Jeannette would feel about the fact that we still have to fight for these things that she knew back in the 1910s, 20s, that these were bad things for democracy, and that but she never gave up too. I think that was another big lesson of hers. I have one kind of offbeat question. She really sacrificed her whole life. She never married. She gave
Yeah.
up having a family life. How do you feel about that? Could she? I almost feel like she could not at that time. I'm not sure she could have accomplished as much as she did if she were a woman of that time, if she had been married and had a family. What do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely not. I mean, she at that time there were a lot of suffragists who didn't get married and never had families. I think it was quite a bit more common. Now we have the 4HF movement or something where women are just like, no, I'm done. That was really common with the suffragists, and that was Jeanette's sort of sense as well that if she were to marry, she would have to sublimate herself and her ambitions, her goals, and her vision to that of her husband. I mean, I specifically don't talk about her lack of romantic relationships in the book because so often women are defined
Mm.
by their romantic
Right.
relationships or their lack thereof. And I wanted her story to be without that, but that doesn't negate the fact, right, that it was like a structural it was like within the structure that women would have to basically abandon large parts of their ambition to their male partner. Um, I would also say one of the things that even though I don't talk about my book, I am a gossip. And so, Mayor Farello LaGuardia of New York, right, the great progressive mayor during the Depression, he was in Congress with Jeannette and actually fell in love with her and asked her to marry him several times.
I did not know.
And yeah, and Jeannette was thought about it, but thought better of it and decided not to.
Given the
Um,
fact of what his future career, his future career, what he went on to do is probably the right decision. It would have made her career much, much
Much
less.
smaller, yes. And he had a wonderful his wife was a wonderful political partner for him,
Right,
and
right,
but
right.
Jeanette didn't want to play second fiddle. She was first chair violin.
And I know that there might be some questions coming in, but before Ann gets to them, I just have one other quick one. Can you also talk about her involvement with the formation of the ACLU, which I don't think
Yeah.
people know about?
Yeah, so, Jeanette was really involved with the plight of conscientious objectors in World War One and protesters. And of course, the Sedition Act, which had its roots, unfortunately, in Montana as a way to suppress minor strikes. Like that legislation was then used as a model for the federal sedition acts, persecuted conscientious objectors and pacifists. And she helped to found the ACLU as a way to get their sentences commuted or to get the charges dropped that against them. And yeah, it's another one of her incredible accomplishments, of which there are so many. It's just extraordinary how much of our current sense of progressive politics and democracy that she had a hand in. I would say the other thing that I always like to mention is she was a founder of the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which still exists, but at the time, right, it was Jane Addams who was the primary founder. But their initial articles of incorporation were Jane Addams gave to Woodrow Wilson, which he then incorporated 9 of their points into his 14-point plan that became the basis for the League of Nations, which became the basis for the United Nations, which is our contemporary understanding of international diplomacy. Most of those ideas were women's ideas
Mm.
that Jeanette had a hand in. And again, you know, again, just to quote another one of my favorite quotes, Harry Beecher Stowe says, "Women are the true architects of society." And when we just peel back the layers a little bit, we find exactly how true that is.
Mm, that's great. And any questions?
Yes, there's a question that says, in today's world, is there anyone that you see as a prominent voice for women?
Um, I always answer this question, and people accuse me of being, too diplomatic in saying this, but I see so many Jeanettes. I think everyone on this call is a Jeanette. The communities of women I see coming like together at this time move me to tears. We all have that grit. We all have that determination, and we all have that vision. Um, it is now I'm very fortunate that my work puts me in contact with so many women like you all, but not a day goes by where I don't meet another woman who is making a profound difference in her community and in our country. Um, Now, just to name names, of course, I love Congresswoman Crockett and Ocasio-Cortez. Congresswoman Ramirez in Chicago is a quiet force. She's doing so much on the ground organizing. Congresswoman Salisbury is incredible. Uh, um, there are just so many. Maxine Waters, of course, for so long, has been fighting that good fight. I think there are just um, so many Jeanettes today. There are just so many out there. It's really, I know things are tough, but uh, I think it's more the fact that the dam's about to break, that they're trying to plug it up with all these crazy things. Um, I love quotes. Rebecca Solnit wonderfully said, "They are the dam and we are the river, and the river always wins."
Mm, good one.
That's good.
Here's another question. Do you see ranked choice voting becoming more acceptable in the near future?
I certainly hope so. I mean, we had some setbacks in 2024, because uh, people who would prefer that that American electoral systems remain as they are, put a lot of money into um, smearing ranked choice voting, but there were a couple of great strides forward, and I think we're that movement is building on it. I mean, people disagree about, Mamdani, but I think people were really fascinated by and encouraged by the electoral process, right? In that there was so much coalition building that in the Democratic primary, it wasn't about fighting, it was about finding common ground. And then the fact that you had the highest young voter turnout in history in New York. You had more Republicans voting for him than any other Democratic candidate in New York history. I think it's all politics is local, right? Mamdani is a good candidate for New York City. He might not be a great candidate for other places, but I think it showed that ranked choice voting helps communities elevate the right candidate for them. Boston recently introduced ranked choice voting. I believe Minneapolis is has ranked choice voting coming online. Los Angeles just implemented it in city elections. And just so you all know, the Oscars are determined
Right.
by
That's right.
ranked choice voting.
Right.
Okay, that's
And of
great.
course, Jeanette's own example and some of the others that you mentioned about showed, the ranked choice, how ranked choice voting can help um, underrepresented communities gain
Yeah.
access to offices that they wouldn't otherwise have gotten.
Yeah, and it's, okay, so Jeanette gives this great example, and I'm not going to go through all the numbers because I can't remember them. But basically, right, there's 2,000 Democrats in San Francisco and 1,000 Republicans and 500 socialists, but the only representative is a Democrat. How is that representative of the democracy, right? Like you have to have minority voices, whatever it is, in government so that all the people are represented. Now, if you're in Kansas, right, the Green Party should have a seat in the state legislature. That's just fair. In Los Angeles, the Republicans should have a seat in the state legislature. Um, and it's like it's about creating an actually representative democracy rather than the tyranny of what is actually the minority, right? Because there are so many different types of view, and if you only have one choice, then that one choice is never really going to be able to represent you. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Okay, do we have time for one more?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. What are the most pressing issues facing women today, and what should we focus on as a League of Women Voters?
Um, I'm not going to say what you should focus on as the League of Women Voters. I think you all are far more qualified to to answer that than I am. But I will say the following. I think we're going to win. I think that democracy is going to win in this next midterm election. And I think it's going to win big. But my concern is that we don't only focus on candidates, that moving forward, we have to focus on structural elements of our democracy. We have to get corporate money out of our politics.
Mm.
We have to implement electoral reforms that allow people to have a say in their government. We have to get rid of gerrymandering. That has to end. We cannot have a sustainable democracy if if politicians get to pick their voters rather than voters get to pick their leaders. And it's really boring, nitty-gritty stuff. And yeah, it is the stuff of revolution. And we need a revolution in this country. So as soon as we stabilize the democracy, that is not the time to sit back. That is the time to shift into the next gear and just go. Because frankly, I don't mean to put it in such hyperbolic terms, but the like our children's future and our world's future really depends on our capacity to be revolutionaries within the next few years. So I would just encourage everyone to rest now as much as you can and get ready to go because it's go time.
Well, Larissa, everything that you mentioned for the League of Women Voters is not boring, and we're working on actively, and it's music to our ears. Thank you so much for tonight and for sharing the example of Jeannette Rankin, who is really should be more well celebrated and more well known. And so thank you for doing this biography of hers and sharing her life with us. Many lessons for us to take forward. So I thank you that, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. We've recorded this, and in a couple of days that'll be on our website if you want to share this wonderful evening that we've had with you, Larissa. Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for having me. This was really lovely.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.